This lesson covers one of the more exciting characters in history, and that's going to be Napoleon. So you have to keep in mind that when we're going over this, Napoleon is actually a part of the French Revolution. He is just kind of considered the end of it, and what you're going to be doing really is I want you to evaluate if Napoleon was a benefit or a positive or a negative for the French Revolution when we're going through this. So what we want to do, we want to look at obviously what effect Napoleon had on the French Revolution. We want to talk about the wars he started, and then we want to talk about how he kind of leads to the more modern Europe. So the vocab we have today, a lot of these are going to show up in the lecture itself, but some of these are going to show up throughout the year, so they're going to be helpful for you to know. A plebiscite is just a vote. It's where voters get a direct say on something. So if there was a law to go to a 4-day school week and voters got to directly vote on it to decide if they wanted to go to that or not. The Napoleonic Wars should be fairly easy. This is just Napoleon's wars that he started in Europe. Annexed is one you definitely want to memorize because this one is going to come up over and over again. Annexed means you're literally adding a piece of land to your territory. Okay, I'll go over the continental system later in detail, but I did put it on here because it's important. Guerrilla warfare is another one that's going to come out throughout the year. Guerrilla warfare is the opposite of where two armies meet each other. It is where fighting is done through like these hit and run tactics. It's usually when one group of or country or group of soldiers is less powerful than the other, so they really don't fight fair. Legitimacy. This is the idea that the government that's ruling over you is the government that's actually supposed to be ruling over you. Napoleon is going to be called illegitimate by most of the other European countries. They're going to say that he's not supposed to be the real leader of France. So legitimacy is also going to be one that comes up, who is like the legitimate government of a country over and over again throughout our year. Okay, so Napoleon starts as a young artillery officer in the French army. He fights during a lot of France's revolutionary wars that we went over in 3-7, where the European monarchies were invading France constantly, and he slowly begins to gain fame and power. What he did, he had some very big victories. He retook key French cities from the British during the Revolutionary Wars and defeated the British. Then he's given command of an army, and he captures northern Italy beside France all by himself with this army and single-handedly ends the war against Austria. And then he even decides to take the fight to the British. So the British's key colony was in Egypt. And Egypt supplied the British with pretty much everything that they needed to keep their economy running. He invades Egypt to try and cut the British off from India. It doesn't work, but it really, he's the first French general to take the fight to the British, to take the fight to these other countries, and it makes him very popular with the French people because he's winning. So you can see here just some of the Britain. This is supposed to be Britain and France, and they're like carving up the world. There was a battle literally in front of the pyramids where the French army fought the British army in Egypt. We're going to get more into that when we get into colonialism, why the British and the French are all the way down in Egypt. But kind of think of Napoleon's wars. They're almost like a world war. They span the entire planet. So, Napoleon's rise to empire. In 1799, Napoleon returns from Egypt, and he's at the peak of his popularity, and he overthrows the Directory. If we remember, the Directory was that 5-man group of rulers in France. And the Directory was not very popular. It was an ineffective government. The people did not like it. It did not work very well. So Napoleon has a very easy time kind of overthrowing it and getting rid of it. He sets up a different system to rule France, and what he sets up is called the consul system. And the consul system is a group of 3 men with Napoleon kind of at the top. So you can think of it as a triangle, and we have one consul here, one consul here, and then at the top is going to be Napoleon. Even though they're technically supposed to be equal, Napoleon is just going to be a little more equal than the rest of them. What Napoleon slowly does is he uses plebiscites, remember those votes, to gain power. The key thing to remember is that Napoleon was basically elected by the French people. They selected him to be their ruler. It's not like he took over in a revolution or some big civil war. The French people really approved of him. So we've gone over this a few times, how the French have lots and lots of constitutions. In 1802, Napoleon writes a new constitution. It makes him consul for life. Effectively, now he has become president for life of France. In 1804, another new constitution comes through that Napoleon kind of encourages, and it makes Napoleon the emperor of France. Now, this seems like it goes against the French Revolution because the French Revolution was all about getting rid of the kings, getting rid of the queens. The French people, it had been super unstable. There had been lots of wars. They'd been invaded a lot. So Napoleon's very popular, and the people vote for him to be emperor. One thing that we need to note about Napoleon, whenever you were getting crowned emperor anywhere, the Pope would come and do it to signify that you were being crowned by God and he approved of you being emperor. When the Pope came to put the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon took the crown himself, stole it from the Pope, and put it on his own head. This kind of symbolizes Napoleon's ego. It's not the Pope or God that's giving him power. It's Napoleon. He took the power in France. You can see in this painting, this is him taking the crown, putting the crown on his own head. Then he took the crown for his wife, Josephine, and he put the crown on her head. Napoleon is making a very clear message to France. Nobody is making him emperor but him. He's in charge. He is the true ruler of France. Napoleon, this is where he kind of becomes more controversial because even though he's obviously a dictator, he's a huge egotistical maniac, he does reform France a little bit. So the Concordat of 1801, its entire goal is to kind of end the religious issues in France. If you remember, we've talked about it in the past, France had a lot of religious issues. Protestants and Catholics, both Christians but different types, fought each other all the time, quite violently at times. So the Concordat is an agreement between Napoleon and the Pope. And what Napoleon agrees to do, he's going to restore some of the power of the Catholic Church. Remember, whenever you see church, it means Catholic Church. But the church is still under state control. Now, when we say state control at this time in France, that really is just going to mean Napoleon, okay? It's going to mean it's under Napoleon's control because he wants to use it to enforce his rule of France, okay? What he does in exchange is he gives religious freedom to pretty much everybody in France. Napoleon's a nationalist. He does not care if you are Catholic, Jewish, Protestant. As long as you are French, you are loyal to Napoleon, and you will fight for France. It is totally fine. That is his main focus. So this kind of ends those religious issues. The next thing he does is the Napoleonic Code. This is his goal of reforming France's laws to make them easier and to bring back stability to France. So the good side of the Napoleonic Code is it uses a lot of Enlightenment ideas. He takes a lot of those ideas from the Enlightenment that were used in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and he makes them official laws in France. So like equality before the law. It did not matter what social class you came from in France now. You were equal. If you committed a crime, a nobleman and a peasant would be treated exactly the same in the courts. He does religious tolerance. This connects to the Concordat that we just went over. It didn't matter what religion you were as long as you were loyal to France. And he abolishes feudalism. That's the old economic system in France. It was very inefficient. Napoleon saw that it was inefficient. It didn't help France, so he got rid of it. You got to think of all of this as about nationalism. It's how does Napoleon make France strong? The Napoleonic Code did have some bad sides, though. And the worst thing was women lost pretty much all their rights. Napoleon was very traditionalist in how he viewed men and women. Men were to be soldiers and workers for France. Women were to be housewives and have babies, because if they had babies, that was growing France's population, which meant more workers and soldiers. So they pretty much lost most of their rights. They were no longer considered citizens. He also considered order more important than individual rights. Individual rights encourages things like individual choice, freedoms, things like that. Napoleon was more focused on how do we make France stable, how do we make France strong. So order was very important to him as opposed to letting people do what they want to do in expression. Throughout this time, when Napoleon really comes to power, we have the Napoleonic Wars. So these last from 1804 to 1812, and you have to think, like, Napoleon's such a big deal. He gets wars named after him. We don't even call World War II the Hitler War. So Napoleon is really the whole reason for these wars. So these are a series of wars. It's not just one war that lasts over this, this time period. And Napoleon's entire goal is to expand the French Empire and protect the French Revolution. If you look at the map down here, by this time period, 1812, Napoleon pretty much controlled all of what we call continental Europe. So whenever we say continental Europe, that means the piece of Europe that is actually on the continent, not the islands. So these areas here that are in this bluish and this purple color, those are Napoleon's allies or areas directly controlled by the new French Empire. The red are the allies of Great Britain, their primary enemy, and the allies of Great Britain. So you can see clearly Napoleon controls most of continental Europe, while Britain is kind of around the outside on mostly islands and then down here in Portugal. The way that Napoleon is going to control continental Europe is he controls it through two primary means. One is war. Napoleon is a military genius. He barely ever loses a battle. So what he does, if your nation steps out of line, you get invaded. And he would actually annex. Remember what annex means? It's one of our vocab words. He would actually add pieces of other countries to the French Empire, especially if French people already lived there. So parts of Belgium, the Netherlands, northern Italy, Germany, they actually get taken from those countries and added onto France. That kind of builds up the French population, builds up French power. The other way that he's going to control Europe is through diplomacy. He puts people like his brother, his cousin, on the throne of other European nations. So his brother becomes the king of Spain. He knows his brother will be loyal to him. That'll keep Spain tied to France so that they won't ally with Britain. He would also force nations to sign treaties, like Prussia. So Prussia is a German kingdom that is kind of near Poland, and they kept on causing problems for the French Empire. So Napoleon came to them and he said, you either sign this treaty that you're going to trade with us and you're going to be our ally, or I'm going to invade you, crush your army, and then we'll see what happens. They didn't want to fight Napoleon, so they signed the treaty. He was that good of a general that just the fear of fighting the French was able to keep a lot of people in line. So there's the French Empire at its extent. These are the places that were allied to it or it actually controlled. You can see it controlled a decent amount of Europe by the end of 1812. The only real threat to Napoleon was the British. He had pretty much controlled all of mainland Europe, but Britain's an island, and it's out of control of the French. What happens, though, at a big battle, the Battle of Trafalgar, which this is the map that shows how it was fought, the British destroy the French Navy. And if you're going to invade an island, you need a navy. So the British are able to keep their island safe from being invaded. So Napoleon has to look for another way to defeat Britain because he can't get there and invade them. And what he comes up with is the continental system. So the continental system is where all the ports in Europe are closed to British trade. Remember, Napoleon controls all of mainland Europe, so he orders all the countries, you can't trade with the British anymore. Britain, being an island, relies on trade to get the things that it needs to survive, including things like food and fuel. So Napoleon's thought is if he can basically starve Britain into submission, he will then be able to knock them out of the war. It ends up not working because the British Navy is able to keep trade open with the United States and India, and they're able to get things that they need into Britain, and Britain stays in the fight. We're going to see that this kind of idea of starving Britain into submission comes up over and over and over again whenever there is a European war. So there's the continental system. This dashed line basically shows the areas where Britain was not allowed to trade. Napoleon ordered all these countries, you can't trade with Britain anymore, starve Britain into submission. So Napoleon, controlling Europe required a lot of war and a lot of troops. And Napoleon begins to stretch France's resources too much. And two of the major things that stretch France's resources are the Peninsular War and his invasion of Russia. The Peninsular War is where Napoleon tried to keep control of Spain and keep his brother on the throne. It was a guerrilla war. The Spanish army knew it couldn't defeat Napoleon's army out in the open, so they fought like this hit-and-run war where they would assassinate a French officer, shoot up a French column, blow up French supply lines. And what it does, it drains French resources. Napoleon has to keep sending troops and weapons down into Spain that France really can't afford to do. The biggest reason, though, that Napoleon is going to fail and to control Europe is his invasion of Russia in 1812. Russia decided to break the continental system and start trading with Britain again. So Napoleon said, I told you if you do that, I'm going to come down, we're going to invade you, and then we'll change your government. So he invades Russia with almost the entire French army. It ends up going disastrously. Pretty much the entire French army is destroyed in Russia because of a really bad blizzard that hits in the Russian winter. And now French resources are drained. France is tired. It does not have its best army. And you're going to see that Britain sees an opportunity here. This is the Peninsular War up top. You can see this is a guerrilla war. The Spanish are more hiding and attacking the French when they can and then running back in the mountains. And then this is Napoleon's retreat from Russia. Most of his army froze to death as they retreated back towards France away from Russia. Like we said, Britain sees an opportunity in this. And Britain gets an alliance of Russia, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and they come together and they defeat Napoleon. They defeat Napoleon, and instead of executing him, they exiled him to the Isle of Elba. This is an island out in the Mediterranean, and the British basically said, we're going to give you a mansion, you're going to live here for the rest of your life, you're never going to cause any problems again. The reason they don't execute him, they don't want him to become a martyr to the French people. If they kill him, the French people will get mad at the British, and they may continue to fight. But if they just get rid of Napoleon, it may calm the French people down enough that they won't want to continue to fight. So they send him to Elba, and Napoleon escapes. He returns to France, raises an army, and he starts what's called the 100 Days Campaign. It's basically Napoleon trying to rebuild the French Empire and fighting the British and that alliance of all the European countries again. Eventually, the alliance defeats Napoleon at the famous Battle of Waterloo. It's the final battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is captured, he is forced to abdicate, and this time he is exiled to the island of St. Helena. And St. Helena is all the way down by Antarctica. The British basically put him as far away from France as they can. That's going to be where Napoleon lives out the rest of his life. He dies there, and it ends his rule of France. There's this 100 Days campaign here, Napoleon returning to his troops. He's very popular in France. To this day, Napoleon is very popular in France. So the effects of Napoleon. After the Napoleonic Wars, Europe is a mess. The map is a mess. There's millions of dead across Europe. It's been a rough time. So the Congress of Vienna is a meeting of all the major European powers. So this is where some of you get confused. This is a meeting, okay? And this is where the European powers sit down to kind of hammer out what are they going to do after the war. And they have two major goals. One, they want to restore stability to Europe. They want to end all the rebellions. They want to get everything back to normal. So they redraw the map. They give areas back their pieces of territory that Napoleon had taken, and then they surround France with a bunch of strong nations. The idea is to keep the French from being able to expand again. So they surround them with a bunch of militarily strong nations to kind of pen France in. The second goal is to roll back the French Revolution. French Revolution starts around this time, 1792, so they're going to take everything back to before 1792. Kings and queens are put back on the thrones of European nations to reverse the French Revolution, the Republic that spread, and even France. Louis the 18th becomes the king of France. So France went from having a king to a republic to Napoleon, back to a king. The concert of Europe is a part of the Congress of Vienna, and this is an alliance. So it's a part of it, but it's an alliance of nations. And the idea is it's going to be an alliance to maintain stability in Europe. So it's going to be all the major powers of Europe. It's going to be Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and France. And anytime that there is a rebellion that was inspired by the French Revolution, something about republicanism, these countries are all going to come together, and they are going to put that rebellion down or put that revolution down very quickly to keep the kings and queens on their thrones. All right, so that's what's going to confuse you the most. Remember that the Congress of Vienna is the meeting. The Concert of Europe is an agreement from the Congress of Vienna. So, Napoleon. You'll hear this said, was he a revolutionary on horseback or was he a traitor to the French Revolution? Some of the good things he did spread the Enlightenment ideas. He spread the reforms of the French Revolution. He spread the idea of separation of powers, consent of the governed. Even though he was emperor, it's like he still believed in the ideas of the Enlightenment. He abolished the nobility. He hated the nobility, like the old lords and dukes and barons and the people who kind of, had money for generations. And he ends serfdom. The idea that there's peasants and they're a different social class. He thought everybody's equal before the law. So that comes back to this Enlightenment ideas. He spread those. He promotes religious freedom. He did not care what religion you are as long as you were loyal to France and loyal to him. So he ends the privilege of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church has to pay taxes where it's going now. Catholic Church, you can't hide in the Catholic Church if you don't want to serve in the French army. And the Napoleonic Code, it established the importance of the rule of law. All right? Laws are more important than your social class. It goes back to that Enlightenment idea. But on the other hand, he started a war that killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. He redrew the map of Europe. He disrupted the economy. Lives were obviously ruined by him. And it was all because he wanted to be emperor of France. So what you have to do is you kind of have to make a decision. Was Napoleon a positive or was he a negative? Was he just another emperor who wanted to build the biggest empire possible? Or was he really bringing the world into like the modern world that we have today? If you have any questions, please just ask, and I hope this made sense of Napoleon.